I have taught school for 22 years, and I know the exact weight of a rifle a man does not want to hold. That morning it hung from my hands like a thing I had stolen, though it had been issued to me lawfully by a lawful officer of the Marin Column, and though the woman it was meant for had, we were told, earned every gram of it. "Load the rifles," Colonel Verl said. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was one of the ways you knew to be afraid of him. He stood in the frost of the courtyard with his gloves on and his collar high, and he looked at the 11 of us the way a landlord looks at a fence he is deciding whether to repair. We do not waste a wall on a soldier, and what they are bringing us is not a soldier. We loaded the rifles. The bolts went home down the line in a ragged little run of sound, one after another, like a cough passing through a cold room. "She flies a machine," the colonel went on, "the way a coward throws a stone from far away over a wall and then she runs. She has no rank that means anything. She wears the patches of a nation that will not even trade a prisoner for her because they know what she is and they are ashamed of it. When this is finished, there will be a photograph. The photograph will say to every pilot who thinks the sky belongs to them, it does not. The sky ends where our rifles begin." He let his eyes move over us. "You will each remember afterward that you did your duty. That is all a man is asked to remember." I believed him. I want that written plainly, because everything that came after only matters if you understand that I stood in that courtyard a believer. I had buried 19 people from my own street in the 4 years of the war, and 11 of them had been killed from the air, from far away, over a wall. And I had come to hate the sky the way you hate a landlord you will never meet, a distant thing that decides your life and never has to look at your face. When they told me the pilot in the cell was a woman, it changed nothing. When they told me she was young, it changed nothing. When they told me her own side had not lifted a finger to save her, I felt something that I mistook, for a long time, for justice. I was 51 years old. I had taught the sons of half the men in that firing line their letters and their sums. I had never killed anyone. I told myself that a man who had lost what I had lost was owed this, and that owing was not the same as wanting, and that I would be able to tell the two apart when the moment came. I could not. That is the whole of what I learned in the end. But I am getting ahead of the story, and a schoolteacher is supposed to know better than that. You have to understand the war we had, or none of the rest will make sense to you. Kavest is a country of mountains that never agreed to be one country. I taught in Marin, a town of gray stone folded into the shoulder of a valley, 3 roads in and one of them washed out half the year. Before the war we grew apples and kept goats and argued about the boundary of the church land, and once a decade a government we had never seen would send a man to count us and then leave. When the fighting came, it did not come as a decision anyone in Marin made. It came the way weather comes. One winter there were soldiers on the low road who spoke like the coast, and the next spring there were soldiers on the high road who spoke like us, and between the two of them our valley became a line on someone else's map, a line that had to be held, and so had to be bled for. The Marin Column was what our end of the valley made of itself, farmers and mechanics and a schoolteacher, an old hunting society given rifles by men who arrived in trucks and left in the same trucks. We were not the villains that the coast's newspapers drew. We were also not innocent. I will not pretend to you that we were. War makes that word useless in about a week. We did what men do when the alternative is watching their town be walked through by strangers, and some of what we did I will answer for, and some of it I did with my whole heart, and I have stopped trying to sort those two piles apart because the sorting only ever made me lie. But the sky belonged to the coast, and the coast's friends, and the coast's friends' friends, the wide alliance of nations whose flags I could not have told apart, who had airplanes and helicopters and the long reach that lets a man kill without ever smelling what he has done. That was the true shape of our helplessness. We could hold a road for a week and lose a village in a minute to a thing that came out of a cloud. My brother's house, with my brother's wife and my brother's older boy inside it, came down in 90 seconds one afternoon in the 3rd autumn, from a strike meant for a fuel truck that had parked, that morning, on the wrong side of a wall. His younger boy, Tomas, lived because he was at my house that day, learning his sums badly and eating my bread. He was 9. After that, he was mine to raise, and the sky was mine to hate, and I hated it with a purity I have never felt about any human being, because you cannot look a sky in the eye. So when the column brought down an aircraft in the pass above the Vashti Gorge in the fourth winter of the war, and pulled a living pilot out of the wreck, and it turned out to be one of them, one of the sky people, one of the faraway hands the whole town wanted to see. And when the pilot turned out to be a woman, a foreigner, a captain of some rescue wing whose name meant nothing to us, Colonel Verl understood at once that he had been handed something more useful than a prisoner. He had been handed a mirror to hold up to our helplessness, and a wall to break it on. I understood it too. I helped guard the cell. I want that written plainly as well. The parade came before the trial, because Colonel Verl was a man who understood that a verdict is only theater, and the theater must come first. They walked her through Marin on the second day, down the one paved street, past the shuttered market and the church with the shell scar in its face. Her hands were bound in front of her. She wore the flight suit they had captured her in, gray-green and torn at one shoulder, and she walked with a limp she was trying not to show, and there was a burn along the left side of her jaw and throat, healing, shiny, that she did not touch or hide. The colonel walked a pace behind her, and 2 of us walked at her sides, and I was one of the 2. He had stripped her patches himself that first day in front of a camera. I saw it. He took a small knife and cut the threads of the wing on her chest and the flag on her arm and the little embroidered word on her breast, her call sign. We would learn later, though it meant nothing to me then, and he let them fall in the dirt and he did not pick them up. "You are not a pilot here," he told her for the camera in his flat, careful voice. "You are not a captain. You are not an American. You are a woman who dropped fire on farmers and then fell out of the sky like a bird a boy hit with a stone. Here you are only what you did." And then, because he was a man who could not resist the last small twist of a knife, a delivery girl. That is all your kind are. You do not fight. You do not stand where the killing is. You carry it in from far away, like a delivery girl carrying a parcel to a door, and you never see the house you leave in pieces. Well, you are in the house now. She did not answer him. I remember thinking that her silence was arrogance, the way a beaten dog's stillness can look like arrogance if you need it to. I know now that it was something else, and that I had simply never in my life stood close to it before. They wanted her to weep on that street, or to shout, or to beg, so that the town could see the sky brought low and made human and small. She did none of it. She walked with her chin level and her eyes forward and her burned jaw catching the light. And when a boy, not Tomas, thank God, some other boy, threw a clod of frozen mud that struck her shoulder, she did not flinch and she did not turn, and I saw her lips move just slightly, and I was close enough to hear. She said very quietly in accented but careful Kavesti, "It's all right. It's a hard thing to be 9 in a war." She had understood the boy. She had learned enough of our language in a prison in a week to know that a child throwing mud at her was a child, and to forgive it before it landed. I did not want to have heard that. I have thought about it every day since. I drew guard duty on her cell for 4 of the 9 days between the parade and the wall, and it is the honest center of this story, because it is where a believer began, against his will, to stop believing. The cell had been the cold store of the market, a stone room with a drain in the floor and one high slot of a window. And they kept a lantern burning in the corridor outside the barred door so that she was never in true dark and never in true light. I sat on a stool in that corridor with my rifle across my knees and my hatred, which I had brought with me like a lunch, and I waited for her to show me the thing that would let me keep it. She never did. She was courteous, which I had not expected and did not want. She learned the guards' names within a day and used them, not to soften us. She was too clear-eyed for that, and never once asked any of us for a single thing beyond what we brought. But because I came slowly to understand, a person who is about to lose everything holds onto the small courtesies the way a climber holds onto small stones. She thanked the boy who brought the water. She asked the old man Farrak, who could not read, whether his cough was any better and remembered the next day to ask again. When they left her too long without emptying the bucket, she did not rage. She waited, and when it was done she said thank you, and there was no acid in it, no lesson in it, just the plain word. She kept herself in order. This is a small thing, and it is not a small thing. In a cold store, bound at night, fed badly, a person can let go of themselves in a day and no one would blame them. She did not. She kept her hair bound back with a strip torn from her own sleeve. She stood and moved through slow, deliberate exercises in the little space, favoring the bad leg, keeping it from stiffening, a soldier's discipline, methodical, unhurried, the discipline of someone who intends to be ready even for a thing she cannot survive. She slept when she could and woke without noise. She did not talk to fill the silence. When she talked, it was because there was something worth saying. On the third night I said to her, I had not meant to speak at all. You know what will happen. Yes, she said. You aren't afraid. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, I'm afraid of most of it. I'd be a fool not to be. She turned her head so I could see the burned side of her jaw in the lantern light and her eyes, which were steady and dark and very tired. I decided a while ago there was one thing I wouldn't give away, whatever else they took. I'm just trying to hold on to that one thing. It's easier than you'd think, once you decide it's the only thing left. What thing? I said, and I heard, to my own disgust, that I had asked it like a student and not like a jailer. How I go, she said. That's mine, that's the last thing that's still mine. She looked back at the wall. Your colonel can have the rest, he's welcome to it. I did not sleep well after that. I told myself it was the cold. The colonel questioned her 4 times, and I stood in the room for 2 of them, and I have thought since that he was not truly trying to learn anything. He was trying to break the one thing she had told me she would not give. He could not do it, and it made him worse. He was good at it in the way that cruelty can be a skill. He did not touch her, he had the camera to think of, and a man of his kind is always thinking of the record. He worked with words and with cold and with time, which are the interrogator's honest tools. He kept her standing. He kept her waiting. He read her the names of Marin's dead, our dead, off a list slowly, one after another, my brother's family among them, and watched her face for the flinch that would let him say, see, she knows, she remembers, she chose it. Her face did not perform for him, but it did not go blank either, the way a hard man's face goes blank, and that was the thing he could not forgive. She listened to every name. When he finished the list she said, I'm sorry for all of them, I mean that. I know it doesn't buy anything. And then, when he opened his mouth to use her apology against her, but I won't tell you I flew those strikes, Colonel, because I didn't. And you know I didn't, because you have my aircraft and you have my record and you know exactly what wing I fly for and exactly what we carry, and it isn't bombs. She said it without heat, the way you would correct a fact in a ledger. You know what I am. You've decided to call me something else because the something else is more useful to you. I understand it. I'd probably do the same in your boots if I'd buried what you've buried. But you and I both know it's a photograph you're after, not the truth. So let's not pretend the truth is on the table. The room was very still. I watched the colonel's jaw work. He had wanted her to lie or to beg or to break, and instead she had told him plainly what he was doing, without insult, without fear, in a voice you would use to tell a man his shoelace was untied. It was the most dangerous thing I had ever seen anyone do, and she did it as if it cost her nothing, and I understood, watching, that it cost her a very great deal, and that this was precisely the point, that spending it and not showing the cost was the one thing that was still hers. You will be shot in 6 days, he said finally, as a criminal, not a soldier. I heard you the first time, she said, not unkindly. You don't have to keep saying it. I'm not going to argue with you about what I am. There's no arguing with a man about what he needs to see. He left. He did not question her a 5th time. And I stood there in the cold store with my rifle and my lunch of hatred gone strangely tasteless in my hands, and for the first time in 4 years, I found that I could not, quite, locate the sky I had come in hatting, because it had, somewhere in those 4 days, put on a human face, and the face had forgiven a boy for throwing mud, and had asked an old man twice about his cough. The thing that undid me finally was not her courage. Courage I could have hated if I had worked at it. The coast soldiers had courage, and I hated them freely. It was a patch and an old man, and a story I already half knew without knowing it was hers. Farek, the old one, who could not read, whose cough she remembered, had been a shepherd before the war and a soldier only by the accident of being alive when the rifles were handed out. On the 5th day he came on shift beside me, and he had one of her patches, one of the ones the colonel had cut off and let fall in the dirt on the 1st day. Farek had gone back quietly and picked them up out of the mud. I never learned exactly why, whether shame or superstition or simple thrift, and he had them folded in a rag in his coat. And on the 5th night he took out the smallest one, the embroidered word from her breast, the one that had meant nothing to any of us, and he turned it to the lantern, and he looked at it for a long time with his old shepherd's eyes. "Emil," he said to me, "can you read this word, my eyes?" I took it. It was a single word, worked in pale thread on dark cloth in the coast's alphabet, which I could read because a schoolteacher reads everything he can get. I read it, and the courtyard and the war and 4 years of clean and simple hatred tilted very slowly under my feet because I knew the word. Everyone in the High Valley knew the word. We just had never known it was a name. I have to go back 3 winters to make you understand. The way I had to go back 3 winters in my own head, sitting on that stool with a scrap of dark cloth in my hand, and a name on it that the whole High Valley had been telling as a story for 3 years without ever putting a face to it. Vashti Gorge is the throat of our end of the valley, a mile-deep cut in the mountains where the river has been sawing since before there were people to name it. Walls of black rock so close in places that at noon the bottom is still in shadow. The one high road that connects the upper villages to Marin runs along a ledge halfway down the gorge's east wall, and in the 2nd winter of the war that road was the only way the upper villages could be reached at all, the low passes having been closed by the fighting and the snow. In that 2nd winter, there was a night the upper valley still tells its children about. A convoy of families, not soldiers, families, the old and the children, and what few young mothers were left, fleeing a village called Estelle that the war had finally reached, was caught on that ledge road in the gorge in the worst storm of the decade. 2 trucks and a string of people on foot, in the dark, in a blizzard, on a 1-lane ledge over a mile of nothing, with the fighting behind them and the road ahead of them cut by a slide. And they were seen. That was the thing. In the confusion of that winter, someone one side, the other side, it has never been settled and it does not matter. Someone had marked that convoy as a military column, and in the last gray hour before the storm closed the sky entirely, aircraft came. I heard this story a dozen times before I ever knew it was hers. Every teller told it a little differently. But the bones were always the same, and the bones were these: that out of the same storm that was killing those families, a single aircraft came down into the gorge itself. Not over it, into it, down between the black walls where no sane pilot flies, where the wind comes off the rock in fists, and the walls give you no room to be wrong, a rescue aircraft. One of the coasts, with the red cross of the medical wings on it, and it flew the length of the Vashti Gorge in the dark in that storm, below the ridgelines in the throat of the mountain, threading a needle that our own bush pilots swore to their deaths could not be threaded. And it was chased. That is the part the upper valley loves, because the upper valley had never once in the whole war seen the sky's own power turned against the sky. There were fast aircraft up that night, interceptors, the coasts or their enemies. The story never agrees, and they went in after the rescue ship, and they could not catch it, and they could not hold it, because it had gone down into the gorge where their speed was death and only her slowness, her impossible low patient slowness between the walls, could live. One of the fast ones, the story always says, tried to follow her into the throat of the gorge and did not come out. She flew a machine built to save people through a killing ground built to destroy machines. And she did it because there were families on that ledge. And she came down and down through the snow with her lights off, reading the walls, reading the wind off the rock, feeling her way down a mile of stone in the dark. That was the flight, but the flight is not why they tell it. They tell it for what she did at the bottom. Because when she found the convoy on the ledge, and no one has ever been able to explain how she found them in that dark in that snow, except that she went slow and she went low and she would not leave until she had. The road was cut ahead and cut behind. The slide had taken the ledge, and there was nowhere for 2 trucks and 40 people to go. They were going to die there. They had made their peace with it. The tellers who were children on that ledge, grown now, say the old people had already begun to pray the prayers you pray at the end. And she landed. There is a widening in the gorge below the Estelle ledge, a shelf of rock the river leaves dry in winter, and it is not a landing field. It is a 90-second window of almost flat stone in the bottom of a canyon in a blizzard, ringed by rock, with a crosswind coming off the water and no room to abort. She put the aircraft down on it, in the dark, in the storm, with the fast one still hunting the ridge above. She set that machine down on a river shelf the way you would set a full cup on a shaking table, and she held it there, rotors turning, while 40 people came down off the broken ledge on ropes and on each other's backs, and on the backs of the 2 men she sent up out of the aircraft into the snow to carry the ones who could not climb. She could not take 40. The tellers all agree on this, and it is the part that breaks your heart. The aircraft could not carry 40 people out of that gorge and clear the ridge in that wind, so she took the children. Every child on that ledge, and the mothers of the smallest, and she left. And the men of that convoy who stood on the shelf and watched her lift their children up out of the throat of the mountain, out of the storm, out of the reach of the sky that had been sent to kill them. Those men stood in the snow and wept and did not know her name. And then she came back. That is the part I did not believe, the first dozen times I heard it, because it is the part that sounds like the thing men add to a story to make it holy. But I have since read her own wings record of that night, the record the colonel had in his own hands and read and set aside because it was not useful to him, and it is true. She flew the children up out of the gorge to the aid station at the head of the valley, and she offloaded them. And she turned that battered machine around into the same storm, into the same hunting sky, and she went back down into the Vashti Gorge a second time, alone, for the men she had left on the shelf. And a third time. 3 times down into the killing throat of that mountain in the worst storm in 40 years, with fast aircraft hunting her the whole night, until every last soul off that ledge, every child, every mother, every weeping man, every one of the 40 stood alive at the head of the valley in the gray of the morning. She lost no one. 40 people on a cut ledge over a mile of nothing, marked for death by the sky, and she lost no one, and no one on that ledge ever knew the name of the pilot who did it, because rescue pilots of her wing do not paint their names on their machines, and she did not stay to be thanked. The upper valley called her in the story only by the thing they had seen, a single light coming down and down through the black snow of the gorge, going where no one could go, coming back and coming back and coming back. The lantern in the throat of the mountain. The lantern. And I sat in the corridor of a cold store in Marin with that name on a scrap of cloth in my hand, and behind the bars 3 feet from me, a burned and limping woman in a torn flight suit was doing her slow, deliberate exercises in the lantern light, keeping her bad leg from stiffening, holding on to the one thing that was still hers. And I understood, finally, and completely, and far too late, that Colonel Verl had captured the lantern of the Vashti Gorge, and had cut her name off her chest and dropped it in the mud and called her a delivery girl, and was going to shoot her against a wall in the morning while her own children, the children of this valley, our children, alive because of her, grew up 3 villages away not knowing her face. Tomas's cousins were on that ledge. My brother's wife's people were from Estelle. I have never been able to prove which of the 40 children were of my own blood, and I have stopped needing to, because by then it did not matter whose children they were. They were the valley's children. She had saved the valley's children, and the valley was going to shoot her for the crime of being able to fly. I did not sleep at all that 5th night. I sat with the name in my hand, and I did the arithmetic of my own soul, and it came out to a number I did not want. I could not free her. I want to be honest with you about the size of what I was, which was small. I was a 51-year-old schoolteacher with a rifle he had never fired, in a town held by armed men who would shoot me and my nephew both without a second passed between the thought and the trigger. I could not open that door and walk her out. There was no version of the night where I was a hero. I have made my peace with that too. But I could do one thing, and I did it, and it is the only thing I did in the whole war that I am not ashamed of. I told them, not the colonel, the men, my own, the men of the Marin column, the farmers and the mechanics, the old shepherd Farrak, the fathers, the uncles, the men who would stand in that firing line with me in the morning, because the colonel had chosen the line himself, and the colonel liked his lines made of ordinary men so that the whole town would be bound to the thing he did. I went to them in the last night, 1 and 2 at a time in the dark, with the scrap of cloth and the name, and I told them what I had read, and I told them the story they already knew, and I fit the face to it in front of their eyes the way I had fit it in front of my own. I did not tell them to refuse. I want that clear. I never once said the word. I was too much a coward to say the word, and also, I have thought about this for many years. I understood dimly that a thing a man is told to do is not the same as a thing a man decides, and that if I told them to refuse I would only be another colonel, handing them another order. And the whole point, the whole terrible point that she had been teaching me for 5 days through a set of bars, was that how you go is the last thing that is yours, and it belongs to no one else. And no one can order it, and no one can take it. And a man's honor is the one thing in a war that cannot be issued or confiscated, but only chosen. So I did not tell them to refuse. I told them who she was. And then I went home and sat with Tomas, who was 13 by then, and asked me why I was awake, and I told him I would tell him in the morning, and I have since told him all of it more than once, because I want him to know that the sky he was taught to hate came down one night into the throat of the mountain, and saved children exactly like him and asked for nothing, not even to be remembered. The morning of the wall came clear and very cold. They brought her out into the courtyard at the back of the market, where a wall of gray stone stood scarred and pocked from older mornings I do not like to think about. The frost was on everything. The colonel was there in his gloves and his high collar, and the camera was there on its stand, and the 11 of us were there in our ragged line with our loaded rifles, and they walked her out across the frost with her hands bound and her chin level and her burned jaw catching the low sun, and she looked at the wall the way she had looked at everything, which was directly, without flinching, as at a fact. They did not blindfold her at first. The colonel wanted the face for the camera, and so she stood against the gray wall with the whole town packed silent along the edges of the courtyard, the way a town gathers at a thing it is ashamed to watch and cannot stop watching, and she looked back at us down the length of the rifles, and she was not looking at the colonel, and she was not looking at the camera. She was looking at the men, at the line, at the faces of the fathers and the uncles and the old shepherd, one after another, the way she had learned our names in the cell, taking each of us in. I do not think she knew then that we knew. I think she believed, standing there, that she was looking at 11 strangers who were about to shoot her for a crime she had not committed, on the order of a man who had cut her name off her chest. And she looked at us anyway, each of us, with something that was not hatred and was not fear and was not pleading. It was the plain regard of one person for another, held steady, given freely, at the last edge of her life, to the men who were going to end it. That is when she said the only thing she said that morning. She said it quietly, but the courtyard was so silent that it carried down the whole line in her careful accented Kavesti, and she said it to us, to the rifles, not to the colonel. She said, "It's all right. I know it isn't your choice. Whatever they told you I am, go easy on yourselves after. It was never your choice." She was forgiving us. Standing against the wall, she was forgiving the firing squad in advance, the way she had forgiven the boy with the mud, because she thought we were only children in a war being made to do a hard thing, and she wanted us to be able to live afterward. And down the line, I heard old Ferrick begin, very softly, to weep. "Present," said the colonel. We raised the rifles. 11 rifles came up in the cold along the line, and I raised mine with the rest, because I did not yet know what was going to happen any more than she did, because I had told the men who she was, but I had not told them to refuse, and a thing you have not been ordered to do is a thing that in the last second may simply not happen, may die in 11 throats at once out of 11 separate fears, and leave her dead against the wall and all of us alive and damned. I raised my rifle and I looked down at the lantern of the Vashti Gorge, and I could not, my hands could not, and I felt the whole 4 years of my hatred stand up in me one final time and find nothing left to hold, because the sky I had hated was not a sky, it had never been a sky. It was a woman with a burned jaw who flew down into the dark 3 times for other men's children and asked for nothing, and I lowered the rifle. I lowered it before the order came. I could not wait for the order. I lowered my rifle, and I stood with it pointed at the frost, and I waited to die for it. But I was not the first. Varag was first. The old shepherd, weeping, had already let the barrel of his rifle sink toward the ground, and beside him a man named Drow, whose 2 daughters were of the upper valley, had lowered his, and past him another, and I understood, watching it run down the line faster than the eye could follow, that I had not needed to be first, that I had not needed to be brave at all, because every man in that line had spent the same sleepless night I had, with the same name and the same story and the same children. And every man in that line had come to the wall that morning already carrying the same decision in secret, each one certain he was the only one, each one ready to be the only one, and the instant the first rifle sank, the secret broke open all down the line at once, and it was not 11 men obeying a plan. It was 11 men discovering in the same held breath that they were not alone in what their honor had already decided. The rifles came down, all of them, 11 barrels sinking toward the frost in a ragged run of movement like a cough passing through a cold room, the same sound as the loading, run backward, undone. We refused. No one had ordered it. No one had planned it. That is the thing I have carried for the rest of my life, and the thing I most want you to understand. It could not be ordered and it was not planned, and if it had been either, it would have been a smaller thing. 11 ordinary men, given a lawful order by a lawful officer to shoot a bound and branded prisoner against a wall, looked at what they were being asked to do and at who they were being asked to do it to, and each one, alone in the cold, chose his honor over his orders, and found in the choosing that he had chosen it with his brothers, all at once, without a word passing between them in that courtyard. She had told me, "How you go is the last thing that's yours." She had been talking about herself, but it turned out to be true of us as well. How we did this, whether we did this, was the last thing in the whole war that was still ours, that the colonel had not managed to issue or confiscate, and we kept it. I have saved the colonel for last, because he deserves to be last, and because his face is the true payoff of this story, and I owe it to you plainly. He did not understand for a moment. That is the thing I remember most clearly. He had given the order, present, and he had drawn the breath to give the next one, the last one, and he stood there with the word in his mouth and the courtyard silent and 11 rifles pointing at the frost instead of at the wall. And for one long moment Colonel Verl simply did not comprehend what he was seeing, because in all his careful theater he had accounted for everything except this. He had accounted for her weeping and she had not wept. He had accounted for her begging and she had not begged. He had accounted for the town's shame and used it. but he had never once accounted for the possibility that the ordinary men he had chosen precisely because they were ordinary might turn out to have, underneath the orders, a thing that was not ordinary at all and would not go down. And then he understood, and I watched it happen in his face. And this is the image I have kept for 30 years the way the upper valley kept the image of the light in the gorge. The blood went out of him. He had been a gray man always, careful and cold, and now he went grayer, white to the lips, the color draining out of his face in the frost as though the cold had finally reached something in him it had never reached before. His mouth was still open on the order he could not give. His eyes went down the line: Ferric, Drow, the fathers, the uncles, me. 11 men he had commanded 100 times. 11 men who had never once refused him anything, standing now with their rifles lowered and their faces set, not mutinous, not shouting, just decided in a way that no amount of his flat, careful voice could undo, because it had not been made by anyone's voice and could not be unmade by one. "Raise your rifles," he said. It came out wrong, too high, cracked at the edge, the voice of a man who has felt the floor of his authority give way beneath him and is reaching for something that is no longer there. "Raise your—" This is an order. You will raise your rifles. You will. No one raised a rifle. He turned to the camera, and I think in that moment he remembered the camera, remembered that the record he had lived his whole cruel, careful life to control was now recording the one thing he could not permit it to record, not the death of the lantern, but the refusal of his own men, the sky's enemy honored by the sky's enemies, his mirror shattered in his own hand in front of the lens. He crossed to the camera, and he struck it off its stand into the frost, and the crack of it was the loudest thing in the whole silent courtyard, and it was the sound of Colonel Verrill losing, and every man there knew it. He was pale as the frost when he turned back. He looked at her, at the lantern, still standing against the wall with her hands bound and her chin level, watching him now with that same steady, plain regard, having understood at last, along with the rest of us, exactly what was happening and exactly why. And whatever he saw in her face, in the face of the woman he had branded a delivery girl and could not now even manage to have shot, took the last of the color out of him. He did not give another order. There was no order left that anyone in that courtyard would obey, and he knew it, and the knowing was written on him in a pallor he never afterward entirely lost. He turned and he walked out of the courtyard through the town's silence, alone, and the theater was over, and the record was broken, and the wall stayed empty of what he had meant to put against it. We did not shoot her, and within the week, I will not pretend the town became brave all at once, or good. It did not. A valley at war does not turn honorable in a morning. But within the week she had been quietly given over to the neutral men who moved the wounded across the lines, the ones with the white flags whom even the colonel's superiors would not be seen defying now that the story of the courtyard was loose in the valley and could not be called back. She went out the way she had come in, limping with her burned jaw catching the light, but she went out alive. Ferric gave her the patches back at the end, the ones he had picked out of the mud. He could not read the word on the smallest of them, but he knew now what it said, and he folded them into her bound hands himself, the old shepherd, and he said something to her too low for me to hear, and she looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded, once, the way you nod to close an account that was never yours to settle and has somehow been settled anyway. She found me last before they took her. She knew by then that I had been the one who carried the name down the line, Ferric had told her, or she had worked it out. She worked most things out. She stopped in front of me with the neutral men waiting, and she looked at me the way she had looked at all of us against the wall directly, without any weight of debt in it, because she was not a person who wanted you to owe her. You didn't tell them to refuse, she said. It was not a question. Ferric said, you only told them who I was. I didn't have the right to tell them to refuse, I said. My voice was not steady. I only had the right to tell them the truth. What they did with it was theirs. Something moved in her face then, the nearest thing to a smile I ever saw on it, which was not much of a smile, but it reached her tired eyes. "That's the whole of it," she said. "That's the only part that was ever worth anything." She looked past me for a second at the empty wall and the cold, and then back. "You gave them their choice back. That's a bigger thing than pulling me out of that cell would have been. A man who pulls me out is a rescue. A man who hands 11 other men their own honor and lets them keep it." She shook her head slowly. "I've flown a long way for less." And then she said the thing I have kept longest, the thing I told Tomas, and told my students in the years after when they were old enough to be told the truth about the war their fathers fought, the thing I am telling you now so that it does not die with me. She said, "You spend your whole life thinking the last thing they can take is your life. It isn't. The last thing is how you meet it, and whether, when you had the chance, you let another man keep his. You kept mine. You helped 11 men keep theirs. That's not nothing, Sergeant. In a war, that's very close to everything." Then the neutral men took her, and she went up the low road out of Marin in the back of a white truck, limping, alive, with her name folded back into her bound hands, and I never saw the lantern of the Vashti Gorge again. I am an old man now. The war is 30 years done, and Kavest is one country in the way that tired countries become one country, out of exhaustion more than agreement, and Marin grows apples again, and the church has been mended, though you can still see the scar in its face if you know where to look. The way you can still see, if you know where to look, the scar the frost put in Colonel Verl's color the morning his own men would not fire. Tomas is grown, with children of his own. I taught him his letters and his sums, badly at first and then well, and I taught him the other thing too, the harder lesson, the one I did not learn from any book but from 5 days at a cold store door and one morning at a wall, that the sky is not a thing to hate, because there is no sky, there are only people, and some of them will fly down into the black throat of a mountain 3 times in a killing storm for children who will never know their names, and ask for nothing. And some of them will cut a brave woman's name off her chest and call her a delivery girl to make themselves feel large. And the whole of a man's life is deciding, when his own morning at the wall comes, which of the two he is going to be. I raised my rifle that morning. I want that remembered, alongside the rest. I raised it believing, and I could not fire, and I lowered it, and I was not even the first. I was one of 11 ordinary men who each thought he was alone and each was wrong, and we did the one honorable thing the whole war ever asked of us, and no one had to order it, because it turned out that honor, real honor, is the one thing in this world that cannot be issued and cannot be confiscated, but only in the cold at the wall, with your whole life in your 2 hands chosen. She taught me that, the woman they told me to hate, the woman my own side branded a criminal and my own hands were meant to kill. The lantern went easy on us at the end and told us to go easy on ourselves. I have tried to. It has taken me 30 years and I am nearly there.